what you count as effective listening and what I count as effective listening, when those things don't match, we get into this meta argument about what is good listening. And then we leave frustrated at this really weird meta level about the fact that Michael's not a good listener because he didn't do X, Y, and Z that Graham assumed he was going to do while Graham was speaking.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. I recently became a college student again. Yes, after 15 plus years removed from college, I'm back, and I'm getting my master's degree in mass communications. And for a class recently, I was reading a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And in that book, I highlighted the following passage. To listen well and observe what's going on around us, we have to stop doing many things we like to do. We have to stop talking, stop the monologue that may be running through our minds, stop anticipating the point the other person is about to make, and stop thinking ahead to what we are going to say next. Really, what this passage in this book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, is advocating for is a listen-first mentality. And that is exactly what my guest this week is here to talk about. And it just so happens he teaches college communication courses. Now, not at Kansas State University, where I am currently enrolled. Graham Bodie currently teaches courses in the Integrated Marketing Communication program in the School of Journalism and New Media at the University of Mississippi. Part of his work at the University of Mississippi includes running the Listening Lab, where he employs a range of social scientific research methods, surveys, experiments, to focus and observe what listeners do when they are called on to attend to others, as it says on his website, grahambodie.com. Graham is also the COO of an organization called the Listen First Project. The Listen First Project is a coalition of more than 350 organizations bringing Americans together across differences with the goal to help us listen first. And, as it says in the passage from the book that I just read, to counteract the things that so many of us feel pulled to do in our conversations, especially those conversations where we disagree on a particular issue or topic, and there are no shortage of those available to us. A lot of what Graham and I talk about in this conversation here on the show this week is the research into why that is. Why are we so pulled to speak and have an opinion and not to step back and listen and consider? Graham has done a lot of research in this area. Listening is obviously an important topic to him, and I wanted to get to how we can adopt the same strategies that he has studied to better listen to each other and not feel the rush that we so often feel to jump in, to let our feelings be known, to accuse, to imply, to assume. Really, it comes down to, how do we listen first? You've done so much research in listening and in communications. I'm curious, based on what you've found, Why is listening not our default? Why is jumping in and participating the default as it seems to be based on your research?
Yeah, I mean, to draw a causal conclusion would be, probably unscientific, but I think there's lots of potential reasons for that. I think, you can look at some research that explores that tendency on a cultural level, right? So looking at the culture of the United States, of Western sort of cultures in general, we have a kind of a speaking centered culture rather than a listening centered culture. So we have language that protects our First Amendment right for the freedom of speech, but we don't necessarily have a freedom to be heard. You do find that language as the sort of the right to be heard in some work on it's either the World Health Organization or UNICEF or one of these other kind of international aid-like organizations that are talking about children's right to be heard. But you don't find that same language in many cases, like in the United States and other Western cultures, right? So, it goes all the way back to, if you look at our favorite rhetorician or sophist or whatever the case might be, right? You have, the definition of rhetoric as a, quote, good man speaking well, or, the definition of persuasion is finding the available means, right, of influence. And so it's all about, being a good rhetor, being a good orator, and this is also true of like early radio research where listeners are assumed to be just passive, consumers of information. And if you can just find the right mix of words and the right sort of tone of voice and the right evidence, then people will just, automatically be persuaded, because listening isn't thought to be an active process. And you don't really get a sense of listening being an active process and listeners being kind of actively involved in shaping the contours of a conversation until 1970s, 1980s, and then more recently with some work on organizational listening. So PR has this same problem. So all of the different traditions of communication studies, media communication, journalism, whether you're an NCA or an AEJMC kind of researcher, all roads point to that our cultural milieu, our sort of architecture, if you will, is speaking centered. And as a result, either we're explicitly or implicitly trained to believe that our primary sort of mode of instruction for our children and our youth all the way through college and so forth is to train people to be good speakers, good persuaders, good writers. And you don't have the same attention to teaching listening. You don't have a course on listening that's required for even a communication major in most universities. And so the imbalance between a focus on speaking and a focus on listening is potentially at least an implicit kind of mindset that people have then. So if we're asking why a person has a tendency to speak first and not necessarily listen first, it's a possible sort of, reason for that or causal, factor for that is just because they've been raised to believe that listening is a sign of passivity, is a sign of agreement, is a sign of you must not have anything to say, and whoever speaks the loudest and, carries the biggest stick, if you will, right, is the one who wins the argument.
That makes a lot of sense how you've put it in that framework that we do put so much emphasis on the speaking, especially we have a First Amendment right to that, right? With that knowledge and that background, Graham, why dive into trying to make listening more of a thing? Like you're talking about changing a culture here. Why that drive? Why that message in the work that you do with your teaching, your research, the Listen First project, which I want to get into? Why the draw there?
lots of ways to be able to answer that question. I'll stick with kind of my scholar or researcher hat, is that what we find in some of the research, interpersonal research in particular, which is my domain of expertise, is that listeners play a pivotal, a crucial role in shaping the contours of a conversation, right? That it is that as Jan Bavelas says, listeners are co-narrators. They are shaping the very sort of structure of the conversation, the likely outcomes of that conversation. Whether you are or feel understood, whether as a speaker you're able to tell your story in a way that helps you make sense of your situation. These things are influenced by how the listener reacts or fails to react. So there's a classic set of studies that some people call the T counting studies. And so you bring two people into the lab and one person is telling a story. Jan Bavelas does this with what she calls close call stories, which is, a time in your life where, there's something happened and, a disaster was just avoided, right? And so one example of this is a woman is reading at night and has a lamp on her, headboard, and she falls asleep reading. And while she's asleep, the lamp falls on the pillow catches on fire. She wakes up to the smoke, and she almost died in a fire. But and this story takes about 90 seconds to tell. And in one condition, you'll have listeners who are told to listen and to listen to the story. And in the other condition, they distract that listener by telling them to press a button underneath the table every time the speaker uses a word that starts with the letter T. And what you find is in those conditions where the listener is distracted, the speaker tells less coherent, less complete stories and tends to repeat themselves or say things like, well, I guess that's it. I guess that's my story. Because they're not getting what she's called specific responses, that feedback that says it's okay to keep going. The floor is yours. I'm interested. I'm paying attention. And so if we can bring some light to the fact that how you act as a listener is just as, if not more important than how you act as a speaker, right? That in and of itself, derived from research, right, suggests that we ought to spend as much, if not more time teaching people how to show up as listeners, right? And then, of course, other elements out of research is there's so many misunderstandings about listening. Like there's one way to do it correctly when what we know is that we all have different idiosyncratic habits of listening and that different situations call for different types or different styles of listening. And so we can get into the nuances of exactly how does Michael show up as a listener? How does Graham show up as a listener? And how does my kind of implicit understanding of what listening is influence me when you're listening in the way that you think listening operates? And I say, you're not listening to me. And you say, but I am listening to you. And we're both listening in those ways that we have learned over time and been socialized over time to listen. And yet they don't match up, right? They don't match up perfectly. And so what you count as effective listening and what I count as effective listening, when those things don't match, we get into this meta argument about what is good listening. And then we leave frustrated at this really weird meta level about the fact that Michael's not a good listener because he didn't do X, Y, and Z that Graham assumed he was going to do while Graham was speaking.
That is fascinating to hear that listening can have that effect on the speaker. How does that, when we pull into tense arguments or discussions or have tense dialogue about divisive issues, how does that scenario that you just outlined display itself? How does that show up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the when you're talking about divisive issues or issues that we're like really ego involved in, where we have a lot of stake in them for whatever reason, that those tend to be kind of identity defying issues, to use a general term there. So like I've wrapped my identity up in believing this thing, right? Whether this thing is a religious thing, or this thing is a political thing, or this thing is like my identity as a parent. And I think that, parents should, spank their kids. And then you come into me and you say, well, the research actually says that corporal punishment for kids is, there's no good research to say that it's beneficial. And there's some good research to suggest that it's actually harmful. Right. And now you're telling me I'm not a good parent. We're not arguing about an issue, right? We're arguing. We've failed to separate the position from the person. And we've done that as the speaker. I've failed to separate myself from my position. And oftentimes listeners fail to separate the person from the position. And we oftentimes listen defensively for positions that we then attack with data and reasoning and logic and all these things. And we fail to see behind that position is a person with desires and with, aspirations and concerns and fears and hopes, many of which probably align with my fears and hopes and concerns and aspirations. And so both speakers and listeners then become sort of entrenched in this sort of battle of identity or battle of ideology or whatever the case might be. And then we just hunker down and become tenacious and say, very, very rarely do we change our minds because someone has presented us with some compelling evidence. Like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So now, tomorrow I'm going to start eating more oatmeal. That's, it's not that easy. Right. And so I don't know if I'm now going on a tangent, but the idea here is that oftentimes when we listen, and particularly about these divisive issues, it really is a battle of identity.
So what do we do in those situations? If it's a battle of identity, and like you just said, minds are so rarely changed in those types of disagreements, what do we do in those situations? Is it even worth it to get into those discussions?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of models of difficult conversations, if you will. Most of them begin with relationship, right? So if you don't have a close relationship that's founded on respect and curiosity and love, for the other person, a mutual understanding that you're both humans and trying to do the best that you can do. If you don't have that fundamental relationship to begin with, then most of these models start with sort of conversations that will simply bring people into closer relationship. That I don't see you as a Republican or a Democrat or a parent who spanks, the kids, or an anti-vaxxer or whatever, label that I've placed on you. That I see you, that I see you as a fellow human operating in this world to the best of his or her ability. And then when we have a relationship founded on those principles of mutual understanding and respect, then we might be able to entertain some issues. But we don't do that by saying, old speech in debate tradition, like, here's the resolution. Let's argue the different, let's attack each other, and whoever yells the loudest, wins, or whoever speaks the fastest wins, right? We do it out of a more kind of, ethics bowl type, sort of seeking truth model, where we try to, first of all, kind of find maybe some common ground, some things we can agree on, some assumptions that we're both okay, taking as givens, or at least at minimum, that we both agree that this issue that we're discussing is important to us personally, right? So if we're talking about, whether we want to mandate masks in schools right now, we can both agree that we want the best for our kids, right? That I want a kid who's healthy, both physically and mentally, that's able to succeed in school, without sort of unnecessary distractions, who's able to learn to his or her full capacity, and who's able to have that full kind of school experience where we play with our friends and we laugh and we get to read and we get to do math. And we also get to, eat lunch together and, go outside and play. And, so both anti-maskers and pro-maskers, however you want to define the quote unquote two sides of the issue, share a lot in common when it comes to what their motivation is for arguing one side of that issue or the other, right? And if you don't have that exploratory process up front that first of all establishes the relationship, second of all establishes some level of common ground, then we'll never, you can argue about the issue all day long, but we're just going to go and probably it's going to backfire. We're just going to hunker down into our little, hermit shells even more so than we were before.
After that process of exploration to find that common ground, and I love how you put it that way because of the whole premise of this show, but how do we keep, as we dive into the dialogue now, we've settled on our common ground, we're now starting to discuss this and recognizing each other's humanity and that we care about this. How do we not bring our bias, our accusations, our assumptions about what the other person believes into the discussion? Is that even possible?
That's right. You can't not bring your own biases into a conversation, including what you think about other people. So there's a lot of organizations that do a lot of good work, but in terms of unearthing stereotypes, there's a couple that hold workshops that center at least some of their activities on that very question. One of them is an organization called Braver Angels, and they have a workshop called the Red Blue Workshop, where they bring up to 8 people who self-identify as conservative or red leaning, and up to 8 people who self-identify as blue or left leaning. And they bring them into usually a half day at least, or a full day workshop. And one of the activities that they do is called the stereotype workshop. And so the group of blues and the group of reds get separated, and they each get expo markers and a big flip chart. And they're asked, what are the stereotypes that people have about blues or that people have about reds, right? And so they go to town. And so reds are we're racist, we're bigoted, we whatever, right? All the things that people think about reds. And then the blues, right? That we hate America, that we want everybody to think there is oppressor and oppressed, that we want to tear down everything, that we don't like structure, whatever all the stereotypes are, right? And then everybody comes back into a group, and you go over those stereotypes, and the blues have to admit what is sort of true about some of those stereotypes. Why might someone come to the conclusion that stereotype is true? As well as you talk about why that stereotype doesn't fully capture, right, what I believe, right, what just in general blues do believe, or what in general, right, reds do believe, right? So we both have to admit that it might make sense if you're a non-red to sort of classify all reds as X, right? Because this, that, and the other, examples. And so through that kind of hour-long discussion about those stereotypes, where the truth lies, where the nuance is, then you can sort of unearth, right, in an open way, here's all the things that you guys probably think about us and what we probably think about you, right? And there's various activities like this. And again, different organizations have different kinds of activities like this. But the principle is that you can't avoid bringing them, but if you avoid talking about them, if you avoid, addressing them, if you just assume that we're all going to be open-minded and not have our judgments and not use those judgments, at least implicitly, right? That you've got to at least recognize the plausibility that, right, everyone is a biased information processor, and we do the best that we can. And so recognizing, acknowledging, trying to figure out where those biases come from, and try to mitigate them in ways that are more productive to have conversation with people who are different. And you can do that inside of a couple of hours, half day, full day workshop, to at least start the process of sort of ever questioning, right, that the only world that I'm able to process is the world that I've seen. And I can either assume that everybody's like me, or that people who are not like me are completely different from me. And I can assume that Michael believes X, Y, and Z because Michael has this kind of political ideology, or I can have a conversation with Michael. I can ask Michael, hey, what makes you tick, right? What are your hopes and your fears? What are your aspirations? What do you want to accomplish in the next 18 months, right? And then I can actually like sit down and listen to your answers and take as truth what you tell me, because otherwise the only truth that I know is the truth that I've conjured up from my echo chamber in the news media that I read and I watch and I find on Facebook. And what we all can agree on is that those channels, right, they work to sell advertising space, which means they need eyeballs, which means they use lots of clickbait, which means that I see what I'm going to click on, and that's not always a healthy way to operate.
Graham, is there such a thing as too much listening? Like we listen too much that it delays active action?
Yeah, I mean, I'm resistant to the idea that listening is an action, but I do understand the need to separate sort of listening to quote unquote the other, or listening to someone's perspective sort of forever, right? Especially in those cases where if you are a person who has experienced a trauma or has had systemic racism, or an upbringing that's involved people demoralizing you because of some identity characteristic like the color of your skin. I'm the first to admit that if your listeners could see me, I mark all of the markers of privilege. I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I'm male, I'm a tenured professor, like all of the things, right? And so I have lots of markers of privilege that allow me to say things like we should listen to people who are different from us. But when the person who is different from us is not just different from us, but is using their position of power to demean or demoralize or restrict my access to, things that are rightfully, or at least, by law, they should be equally mine, then yeah, you don't, I'm not telling someone to go listen to a Nazi. Like, that's not the point, right? Although if we don't, if someone doesn't, then they're left to their own, kind of proclivities. And so there is some potential power to at least someone hearing that story and trying to understand, right, what makes those people tick, and potentially how to stop that kind of a hatred, right? So yeah, I mean, there are limits because we do want to change, so we can listen all day long about, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and their opinions about the infrastructure bill. But if we don't put something on paper and eventually pass that bill, then we won't ever have new roads, new bridges, new whatever, right? So yeah, I mean, you're never going to satisfy everyone. You're never going to have 100% agreement on something when you have, issues that are at scale. And then there are issues about, is it just majority? How much do you listen to public opinion when public opinion is going against, public health experts, for instance? In the case of, my own school district here, you have lots of parents that don't want kids to wear masks, but you have the CDC saying it might be a good idea for everyone, even if you're vaccinated, to wear masks, particularly around kids who are under the age of 12 who can't be vaccinated. Does the governor listen to the parents, or does the school listen to the parents? Does the school listen to the CDC? And so you have issues of, does the squeaky wheel always get the grease? and that minority voices that oftentimes don't get heard, therefore their opinions don't get put into place into the public dialogue, and therefore into, so yeah, I'm totally aware of all of these critiques of the idea that listening can somehow be a panacea or a salve or like our saving grace. And that's not my point. I'm not saying that if we just all listened to each other and we all got along and we would sing some kumbaya, that we would never have racism, we would never have sexism, we'd never have homophobia, we'd never have, right, fill in the blank, right? And so at some point, yeah, you have to take a stand, you have to protest. And so what I always say is at least personally, I'm going to choose to listen first. That might be because I have many markers of privilege, and that's where I need to be. And I stand beside, but more often behind, those whose voice has been suppressed or marginalized historically, right? So I'm not telling individuals who don't look like me to do what I do, right? But I do think for all people, regardless of their position or their power, at some point in your existence, there is a good reason to try and listen to people who are different from you.
I love the nuance in that answer, Graham. There's that gives me chills. I want to jump back to you've maintained this whole time that listening is not passive. It's not a submissive act, that it is active. What are the markers of active listening? Going beyond just what I think we've all kind of been told it maybe by a teacher someday, like, oh, it's nodding your head when there's an answer. Like, I got to assume it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that term active listening is a little bit potentially of a misnomer, because listening is an active process always, right? There's no such thing, right, as passive listening. If it's passive, then I would say it's something else like hearing or something like that, right? So, I mean, there are multiple behaviors that you can enact. I like to think about them in terms of like being, your listening toolbox or your repertoire of listening behaviors, like the variety of things that you can enact should they become appropriate for enactment. In our culture, it's eye contact. Your parents said it when you were a kid, look at me when I'm talking, and of course, when we have our phones and when we oh yeah, I'm listening to you. It's like, the fact that research suggests that you're not multitasking, you're switch tasking, and you're sort of, losing your ability to actually, fully attend to and attune, to the other person. And then if you read any, Forbes or this or that or the other, the 5 things you need to do, you'll find things like ask questions, paraphrase, those kind of things. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, I teach those behaviors. I think those behaviors are essential to show that you're listening. And in fact, some of the research that we've done in a couple of different contexts shows that when people judge you as a good or a bad listener, their judgments, their evaluations are predicted more by your what we might call verbal or auditory acts of meaning. Your not just your head nods and your eye contact and stuff like that. It is when you respond with something appropriate, or when you ask a question, or when you paraphrase, or when you gasp out of surprise because they've told you something surprising. I mentioned Jan Bavlis early on. She calls these the difference between generic responding, which is your back channel responses, your your yeah, you're right, or your head nods that can go anywhere in a conversation. You can kind of, if they happen at second 3, you can move them to second 7, and there's no change in the dynamic. And she contrasts generic responses with what she calls specific responses, which are tied to specific moments in the conversation. And so when someone says something surprising, you have to look and sound surprised right then. You can't look and sound surprised 7 seconds later. Right. And so when we talk about active listening, I think that's the key, is regardless of the specific behavior that you enact, it's tied to moments in the conversation that communicate to the speaker, right? I'm paying attention to you. You're important. Keep going. Tell me more. I really want to hear this story. Oh my goodness, this is so interesting. And by extension, oh my goodness, you're so interesting, and I appreciate you, and I value you, and I respect you. Herb Clark talks about signaling understanding at the moment, so that the speaker has a sense that for the moment I'm understood. Right. And as we continue to signal our momentary understanding many times over the course of the conversation, right, that builds a better conversation, a better conversational flow, a better ability for that speaker to feel like I can say a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. If you notice, just like a good movie critic will ruin movies, I'll ruin conversations for people all the time. If you notice that most people, when they start to tell a story, they won't speak for more than about 90 seconds or so, maybe 120 seconds before they pause at least a little bit to, are you paying attention? Are you paying attention? And it's in those moments when they make eye contact with you as the listener, that's when you do this, right? It's called the mutual gaze window. Speakers don't look at listeners 100% of the time when they're speaking, but when they do look up to the listener engages in these kinds of behaviors, right? And that, I think, is what a more nuanced or scholarly definition of active listening might be, is always being on, attuned, actively trying to signal to the speaker that I understand you good enough right now for the purpose of you continuing. I want you to continue. And again, by extension, that I value you and in this relationship. And I'm sort of putting my time and I'm investing my energies into this conversation.
In contrast to that, Graham, in prepping for this conversation now, I came across something you said that you can't always listen to your fullest. What do we do? What do you recommend we do in those moments where we feel like we just can't do it right now?
Yeah, I mean, we can either try to fake it, which it may be okay in some instances, but in many instances it's I can't pay attention to you and do the other thing that I need to do right now. And so try to get a sense of whether the activity that you're engaging in that the speaker is interrupting, at the moment, whether that activity is more important or the speaker at that moment is more important. Right. And in some situations it's hard to make that decision because, you're doing something that's, you're filling out a form online that if you pause for more than 30 seconds, it resets itself and, you've spent an hour on the form, but someone is coming to you with like a really pressing time sensitive issue right now that if not resolved in the next 30 seconds, you've got two tasks that you're supposed to accomplish simultaneously that are equally important. And so I'm not suggesting that it's always easy to decide, right, to stop what you're doing, to pay full attention, or to tell the person, I can't pay full attention to you right now because I have to do this other thing. But I think the more that we can have those meta conversations about, right, why I'm responding the way I'm responding and what I'm doing and why it's important and how you're also important. And I want to be able to, pay full attention to you. If we can have those honest, exchanges, then I think, both people won't be completely happy always, all the time and satisfied. But it's better than just, putting your hand up and saying, meh, don't, right. That, especially for a kid. And look, I'm guilty of this too. I'm not saying that I always, take my own medicine or always do the right thing. But as I tell my students, like, at least I know when I mess up, and I have the tools to be able to correct those mistakes when I make them. So, try to be a good parent is to try to realize that, sometimes you have to, get on your knees, talk to your kid like an adult, not put a hand up and tell them, meh, right? But have a conversation with them about how right now I need to do this. And I do want to pay attention to you, but it may be, maybe 15 minutes.
Graham, is there a story or an anecdote that kind of underscores all of this that you like to point to and say, look at the power of what it means to listen and what it can do? Do you have any examples for us?
Well, I mean, my work with Listen First Project, we just in June finished a big national event called America Talks. And then the following week was what we call National Week of Conversation, which this year was our 4th annual National Week of Conversation. And so America Talks was an opportunity for people with different political ideologies, people who self-identify as kind of supporting President Biden and being liberal, versus people who don't support President Biden and tend to be conservative, to enter a conversation, not about who won or whether the election was rigged or whether we should, get the vaccine, not about any issues, right? But just simply an opportunity to connect, so that you might be able to see people as people, not necessarily as representing a political party or an ideology. And the event brought together thousands of one event on the Saturday, Sunday, and then the week after that brought thousands of people across multiple modes of differences together into conversation. And as one sort of, marker of success, if you will, we had something crazy like an 80% response rate on our survey, which if anybody that does surveys knows that's insane response rate. And overwhelmingly, people said that they would do this again, recommend other people that they know to do this. And then we got hundreds of video testimonials of people crying, emotional, I wish my cousin so-and-so would just do this and see that the people on the other side are not evil, that I had a conversation with so-and-so and I was scared and I thought it was going to go off the rails. And then, we both shared that we, like to go fishing or whatever it was, right. That brought them together. And just that power of violating in a good way expectations of how a conversation with someone who's different from me can go swimmingly well, if not just overwhelmingly positive, right? And the idea, of course, is that if we can get, instead of thousands, which is a decent number for an event like this, but if we could get millions of Americans doing this not just once, but maybe once a month, where they began to also do this in their communities with different subsets of people across different markers of difference, that how much more could we accomplish together if we operated like what we call bridge builders or weavers versus dividers and ideologues, right? What if we took seriously the idea that we are all in this together, that we're not in the same boat, but we're at least in the same storm, and that some people have life jackets and other people have yachts, but the conditions around us influence us all, even if in different ways. And how much more powerful is it to hear that other people have other experiences and other perspectives and other ways of experiencing and seeing the world, and that's okay. And there's power in realizing that, and then putting together an action plan for how to solve some of the issues that we have in our local communities and at the national level.
Yeah, day in, day out. That's remarkable, and I love those stories. Day in and day out, like how do we apply that same framework to our lives, where we're going to the grocery store, we're grabbing dinner to go, we're going to kids' soccer games or football games or volleyball games. Like what is the day in and day out application to our lives look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'd ask you, like, how many times do you ask a stranger, "How are you doing"? Do you ever ask that question?
I do.
What happens after you ask that question?
Yeah, it's most of the time it's just I'm doing good as we pass each other,
and you're like, awesome.
Yeah.
Right. Right. What have you actually said? How are you doing? And when a person says fine, you say, is that the truth or is that the easy answer? Right. Like, and actually spent 5 minutes listening to that person's story, or instead of asking how are you doing, which really is another way to say hello at this point.
Right.
What if you asked a different question that really solicited their story? Right. Hey, tell me your story. What's something that made you smile today, or what's something that made you sad today? Right. When your kid gets in the car from school, and I find myself doing this and, hitting myself over the head, I say, how was your day? What are they going to say? How was your day?
Fine.
Good. I mean, right. But instead, if you said, what's something that happened at school today that made you smile? What's something that happened at school today that made you sad, or that was sort of off, right? That made you question, right? That made you go, huh? Right. There was a song when I was growing up. It was like things that make you go, huh? It's like what's something that happened today that made you go, huh? And it's those questions that aren't easily answered with a one-word response, right? So I train people to listen, sales teams sometimes to listen. And when somebody says, they say, when customers come in and, how do you get a customer to open up? When I ask them questions, they just give me one-word responses. And my immediate response is, well, what questions are you asking? Right? If you're asking yes or no questions, and you expect the person to interpret that as tell me a 2-minute, right, monologue of what happened today, right? That's your fault as the question asker. There's a dynamic here that the listener or the responder only gives you the information, right, that they feel you want. And if they feel you only want a one-word response, then that's all they're going to give you. But if someone really feels that you're open, right, to more than a one-word response, they'll give it to you, right? So, and I have a little lesson that I say, people are like gas; they fill up all available space. And so, if you can structure your questions, if you can structure your conversations to open up that space, and then actually have the time to sit and allow that space to be filled, that's what we want to try to do. And again, you can't do this with everyone at every moment of your entire life, right? It's impossible, right? But choose a moment with a person on a day this week and try it out and see how it works and see what that person comes away with and see what you come away with.
Man, I'm going to commit to that. I challenge the listeners to do it as well. It takes getting out of your comfort zone, right? It takes getting a little bit uncomfortable at first, and then it eventually becomes like second nature, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm the last person to say that I always do the things that I know I should do. But there's some moments where I'm like, yes, I did the right thing. So like yesterday, I was talking to my 13-year-old and I was asking her, what happened today? Tell me everything that you remember. And at the end I said, well, what else happened? What else happened? She said, well, nothing else happened, okay. But then this morning, she woke up and the first thing she did is she said, I forgot to tell you something. Right. So, and all it took was that last bit, that last question. And it's simple. What else? Right. What else do I need to know? What else do you need to tell me? Right. We know this from doctor-patient interactions that and of course, physicians are scared to death to ask that question because they think that it's going to be another 3 hours and they're going to be stuck in the room with that patient. But what we find is that spending a minute now will save you hours later, because the patients who tell you their full story are better diagnosed, more likely to adhere to medical recommendations. You're more likely to get the real reason they came to the physician's office that day, and all of these other outcomes, right? And I think that finding has wide applicability for parenting, for teachers, for social workers, for talking to the person at the grocery store, wherever you are. I think you can implement some of these ideas. And again, you don't have to do it with everyone. You don't have time necessarily to do it at all, at every moment of the day. But choose one person, one interaction, one time this week. Just try it once. And if you liked what happened, maybe next week you try it twice. And then the next week you try it 3 times, right? Until you get into more of a habit of finding, spaces to allow people to open up.
Wonderful. Beautiful stuff, man. You mentioned briefly the Listen First Project. Before we kind of begin to wrap things up, just what is the Listen First Project and your involvement with it?
Yeah, so Listen First Project, founded in 2013, attempts to bring together what we try to aggregate, amplify, and align the hundreds, if not thousands, of efforts across this country and indeed across the globe that seek to bring people into difficult conversations across difference, right? Appreciating our common humanity and respect and need for mutual understanding. And so we organize a coalition of over 350 organizations, and we try to resource those organizations as much as we can, creating collaborative spaces, campaigns, and innovations that allow those organizations to reach more people than they would on their own, right? So we do a yearly National Week of Conversation, and then along the way, when partner X has an event, we try to say, hey, anybody else who wants to support that event, right? And so we try to, and when I have conversations with these organizations, I say, oh, you're doing very similar work to these other organizations. Y'all should have a conversation. So we try to be that hub, if you will. We call it kind of an umbrella organization that tries to organize all of these efforts and to present them to the regular everyday person as look at all of the opportunities that you have to be a bridge builder, to be somebody who resists the temptation to demean or demoralize or dehumanize someone on Facebook, but instead seek to understand what makes that person tick, right? And we've been doing this work again since 2013, and really hot and heavy on the coalition front since 2016, 2017. And we've grown from 4 organizations originally to 350 organizations, or actually like 368 the other day. And that's what we do. We champion and organize and help run these big collaborative national campaigns and innovations.
Graham, thanks so much for this. I greatly appreciate just your wisdom and perspective on this topic of listening. I would love to ask one final question, which is, what's a question that you wish you were asked more about all of this?
Where do I sign up? And how do I get involved? So the answer to that is listenfirstproject.org. You can sign the pledge, which gets you in the email distribution list. And then you can go to the coalition tab and you can click on the 300 and however many, 368 logos of the organizations and find out all the opportunities, and then if you want to try your hat at a conversation event, there's a website called citizenconnect.us, which is our common calendar. And there's events happening, pretty much every day of the week, different times that usually online that people can get involved in to experience what all this is all about.
Is there anything I left out or I should have asked about or something that you wanted to make sure we talked about that I forgot?
Yeah, I could talk about this stuff all day, but but I think we hit some high points, and I would encourage listeners to challenge me on anything that they disagree with or question anything that they may sort of have experienced differently. I'm not the arbiter of all knowledge or the collector of everything that's right. So I love to say that I might be wrong, and that's okay. And trying to learn, a little bit every day. So would love to hear any listener feedback or comments or, anything that people have to say that might be good, bad, or whatever.
Fantastic stuff, Graham. Thank you so much for joining me, man. I appreciate this. This was a great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Happy to be here.
Inspiring and encouraging stuff there from Graham Bodie. Many thanks to Graham for sharing his wisdom and his perspective and all the experience that he's had here on the show this week. Please do me and Graham a huge favor. Share this episode with your network, someone you know who might find some value in listening to today's conversation. And that's the key word, listening to today's conversation, absorbing what Graham had to say, and hopefully applying it to all of our lives, that we all can do that after listening to Graham's words. And if you like the amazing conversations with guests like Graham that I have on each and every week, please subscribe to the show so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.